Welcome to this special report. I'm Crystal Goodremote, and today we'll be discussing the ethical journalist. Plagiarism and fabrication remains problems that the field of journalism have dealt with throughout the years, from Janet Cook to Stephen Glass. This year alone, there have been numerous instances of plagiarism and fabrication. An award-winning reporter for Hearst newspaper was fired in June for fabricating sources and quotes in at least 25 stories. Jonah Lehrer, a staff reporter for The New Yorker and celebrated author of 3 books, was also dismissed this year for plagiarism. One of the most recognizable names in the field of journalism for plagiarism and fabrication is J.C. Flair. At the beginning of the century, J.C. Flair was a young journalist wanting to pursue her career in journalism and help people. However, as time progressed, Flair, much like Lehrer, became more interested in the amount of work rather than the quality. Now let's go to Bethany Brock, who is in the studio with J.C. Flair. Bethany?
Today we have Ms. Flair, former reporter of the New York Times, joining us. Ms. Flair, thank you for joining us today.
Thank you, Bethany.
Ms. Flair, were you reminded at all of your own story when you heard about Jonas Lehrer, who made up quotes but attributed it to Bob Dylan's song?
I mean, it's got striking similarities. His youth, his prominence, even the way that I think he tried to defend himself by minimizing the story. All of it just rings so similar. It's kind of sad to me that we haven't learned these lessons yet. Journalism is a profession that's built on this notion of trust.
And trust is something that you struggle with, along with many other reporters in your field. Let's talk a little bit about your experiences as being a reporter and the repercussions of those. Can you tell us a little bit about your first mistake?
Well, it was a last name. I interviewed a guy who had been trading on the markets right after September 11th, and he refused to give me his last name. So I felt that the story wouldn't make it without a last name, so I made it up. It was a mistake. It was wrong.
You also said that you were at the home of Jessica Lynch's parents' house in West Virginia, and you also said that you were in the home of a soldier who was in Ohio when you were not. You were never in any of these places, correct?
That's right. I recreated the events without ever actually being there. I violated a lot of ethical standards that went way beyond just cutting corners.
Yeah. Why did you not think this was wrong at the time?
Well, I mean, clearly the one thing here is that I was playing fast and loose with ethics in general. You know, a lot of journalists have a much more solid ethical ground than I clearly did at that point. I'm trying to come back to my roots. I wasn't raised that way, and I'm trying to come back to that root of honesty and integrity and ethics.
And what motivated you to make this stuff up?
At the time, I felt that lying was the only way that I could survive, because I had an extremely stressful job with grueling hours, tight deadlines, and this incredibly high just standard of excellence. And in addition to my bipolar disorder, it all contributed to ultimately my decision to be dishonest. But it kept spiraling out of control, and just keeping up with all the lies was painful.
Now, did you know that what you were doing was objectively wrong at the time, or were you just more concerned about not being caught?
I thought that once I felt better physically and emotionally, I would hit the road again, but it just crept up on me, and the deceptions got bigger and bigger and more daring and daring. I knew that what I was doing was wrong, but I was just focused on more day-to-day survival. That doesn't excuse it, and obviously there is a character flaw in me. Lying is something that I'm going to have to guard against till I go to my grave. I admit that I have a weak spot.
In another story you wrote about the New York Times, the Reverend Tandy Sloan, whose son was killed in Iraq, you wrote that he bowed his head and started to cry at his Cleveland church. But you had not even been to this Cleveland church, correct?
Correct.
So how could you do this to a man who suffered so much and ultimately gave the ultimate price, which was his life?
I really was selfishly thinking about myself. and I wasn't, focused on how my stories would impact people and that the things I was making up would impact people. In retrospect, I feel terribly sorry, not just to those people who lost their jobs because of the situation and what I wrote, but also the sources. It's very painful to have something not true written about you. I mean, I was selfishly just trying to hide the fact that I was in a lot of trouble and pain and not doing well. I was trying to make it seem as if I could do something, but I really wasn't prepared to do it, and I truly am sorry for all that they have suffered because of it.
You mentioned that you went through some very low points in your life, such as cocaine addiction, and you even said that you wrote some stories while you were high or drunk. Is this correct?
Yes, it is correct. It took over my life. I made horrible choices with drugs and alcohol that cost me much and landed me in such a horrible place.
Right. Perhaps one of the worst examples of your deceit was the story that you filed about a family in Texas dealing with a missing soldier. Can you explain that?
Well, I tried to use all of the usual tricks of the trade, but none of them were really working. I couldn't get a hold of the family. I tried on the phone a lot of times, but instead of just saying I need more time to work in this story or going down there and actually talking to them in person, I ended up just entirely plagiarizing from other news accounts. The Washington Post found out about it and published a story about my plagiarism, and that's when I knew this game was over.
How did you react when you came to that realization that the game was over?
Well, not very well. I attempted suicide and then resigned and spent a few days in a psychiatric care facility.
Wow. You've talked and written about the role of mental illness in your problems. Most people can't find this as a very satisfying explanation because you were mentally ill, but you are still capable of these elaborate deceptions. Where you went into the photo archives and reconstructed scenes and things like that. Would you say mental illness did play such a big role in your fabrications?
Well, first off, I would say that a lot of people don't quite understand mental illness. It doesn't necessarily mean that you're incapable of doing or creating interesting things, but I would say that even though I was suffering a lot under my bipolar disorder and that it greatly affected my life, I can't ultimately use it as an excuse. And I'm not trying to do that, but it did greatly influence my thinking and my decision making.
But you could have gone on vacation or told someone or asked for help.
And that's a good point. At that time, I wasn't thinking clearly, and even though I did know the difference between right and wrong, I was trying to survive, and it was just a really painful time for me. But again, that's not an excuse, and I have to take and am taking full responsibility for those decisions.
Mental health experts have determined that this was not a valid excuse for your deception, correct?
Yes, and like I said, it was definitely a contributing factor to what caused me to ultimately lose control of my life. And there were periods of depression where I wouldn't get out of bed for days, but there are also really points of high mania where that led to like a grandeur thoughts and kind of wanting to push the limits and deceive and get away with it, and it was almost like a game or a risk-taking thing.
Right. Let's talk a little bit about your book. Why did you choose to write a book?
Well, I had a very important reason to write the book because I think a lot of people can learn from my experience. There are a lot of young people who are under pressure, whether you work at Wall Street Journal or you work in a factory somewhere. And I think that there are plenty of topics, especially in the case of journalism that are discussed in the book that I think we need to have a healthy discussion and debate about.
With your history of lying, why should anyone trust what you said in your book?
Because I'm done lying. I'm come clean, and I don't desire to twist the truth anymore. I want it all to come out, the good, the bad, and the ugly.
But it sounds in many ways that you are a pathological liar. You began in college and it continued to escalate through your career. You made up details, quotes, and conversations that never happened. How do we know that you are done with these lies? How can we believe a word you say?
It's impossible to know for sure, I guess. People are going to have to read the book for themselves and make their own judgment. There's nothing that I can give other than my word.
But you've duped people before. What does this word even mean to you?
That's a tough question. I guess my word hasn't meant much of anything in the past few years.
Are you sorry for what you did?
Yes, I'm completely sorry for what I did. Even though something good might come out of all this, it doesn't change the fact that those were painful things, not just for me, but for many other people. I am contrite and I am so sorry. I know I need to work to repair some of the damage I've done, and I know for sure that I would never want there ever to be another J.C. Flair.
Great. Well, thank you so much for joining us, Ms. Flair.
Thank you.
Now let's go to our ethical expert, Becca, to hear her take on Flair's actions.
Thanks, Crystal. According to the ethical model of home structure, there needs to be a base that serves as the groundwork for decision making. In the case of J.C. Flair, that base is truth. Truth is an undeniable requirement that is seen all throughout Scripture. Just one example is Proverbs 6:16 through 19. This passage lists the 7 things that are an abomination to the Lord. In that list of abominations is a lying tongue. In the Hebrew, the word is sakar, and is translated literally as deception. R.L. Harris, in the Theological World Book of the Old Testament, says that in whatever context or circumstance that the word sakar is used, it is always linked with the fact that God will not condone it. Since God is a God of truth and reality and faithfulness, His people should also be characterized as such. There are countless other passages of Scripture that I could use to present as a defense of the importance of truthfulness. But even with a minimal level of study, it is clear that God considers lying a serious offense and as a violation of His commands. The next level of home structure is an exceptionalist principle that you can derive from the base, which in this case is be honest and don't lie. If God feels so strongly about the wickedness of lying, His followers should abandon that sin and live lives of truth instead. The third level in home structure is area rules. In other words, what does the moral principle require in specific areas of life? In this case, with journalism, these rules include, but are not limited to, getting the facts straight, telling the truth in its proper context, properly attributing information, and making sure that you used your own work and not the work of others, which is plagiarizing. Home's final tier is case decisions, which is applying those area rules when making a specific decision. In the case of J.C. Flair, the New York Times made the correct decision by bringing Flair's falsehoods to light. Flair needed to be fired since she violated almost all of those area rules. The Times acted ethically by informing the public of Flair's fabrication when they could have covered it up. The truth about Flair's dishonesty was brought to light, and that is exactly what needed to happen.
This concludes our special report on the ethical journalist. Thanks for listening. I'm Krista Goodremote. Have a nice day.